I've always been fascinated by the ballet since I was a child. Like most little girls, I entertained thoughts of being a ballerina, but that probably had more to do with the sparkly outfits and wanting to dance. Whilst I don't particularly want to be a ballerina anymore, although I do envy that level of fitness and flexibility, the fascination continues. But this time it's definitely down to more than pretty dresses, although that is still a huge part of it. I like pretty dresses. A lot of ballets we hear about, Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty, The Nutcracker, are either fairy tales or have the echo of fairy tale about them. And fairy tales are a huge interest of mine. So I decided I would finally bite the bullet and dive down that rabbit hole. It turns out there are not as many fairy tale based ballets as I'd expected. There have been ballets about almost every subject under the sun, from propaganda for the CCP, Russian folklore, football, Creole culture in Louisiana and Billy the Kid. You name it, there's probably a ballet about it. Ballets have been inspired by history, folklore and legend, novels, poems, films, operas, art, Bible passages, miracle plays, and in one case, a painted fan. When I first started looking into ballets, I assumed that the really famous ones, your Swan Lakes and Nutcrackers, were just popular examples of the norm, that most ballets were full-length stories told with the medium of dance, but actually, a lot of ballets are very short, with some being only a few minutes long, and are actually just celebrations of the form, not a medium for telling a story. The ones with a proper plot are not actually that numerous. Ballet may sound like it originated in France. After all, most of the terminology is aggressively French, but it was actually born in the court of the Italian Renaissance of the 15th century. The word ballet actually came to French through Italian, ballo or balletto, and all goes back to the Latin root of ballare, to dance, which is also where we get the English ball. Ballet was just another dance element you might enjoy during lavish events, along with music and singing. Catherine de' Medici helped the form along by funding ballet in her courts, known then as ballet de cour. They were especially popular in France, where the comédie ballet, a drama which mixed spoken narration with music and dance, continued the art. Later, Louis XIV popularised and standardised the form, and even got stuck in with writing and performing them. It was his influence and passion which elevated ballet from an amateur dance to something that required proper training. But ballet still wasn't its own thing. There were opera ballets, which were danced pieces with sung narration, but it wasn't until the early 18th century that ballet separated itself as a mime dance, or ballet d'action, and used expression, movement and props to communicate the action. The main contender for the first modern ballet was performed in 1717 and was called The Loves of Venus and Mars. That and Matthew Bourne are probably the biggest elements us Brits have contributed to ballet. Yay! It wasn't until the 19th century that we got a lot of the big works. Classical ballet, which pushed for exceptional technique, romantic ballets rife with magic and folklore. Point work came into fashion, plot-driven ballets based on books and stories and plays were being written and choreographed. Then, with the 20th century, came the modern and neoclassical ballet. People like George Balanchine, I don't know how to pronounce his name. He came onto the scene, with plotless pieces, more concerned with pushing the form and creating atmosphere and emotion through symbolism than actually communicating a story. And so, here we are today. In this series, I'll be taking a look at some of the more well-known plot-driven ballets, the root of their stories, and how they were translated into this very specific form of dance. Today, because this journey was born out of a love of fairy tales, we're going to look at one of the more famous fairy tale ballets, Sleeping Beauty. Whilst I've watched bits and pieces from several ballets on TV, the only one I've ever seen live in a theatre is Sleeping Beauty. Thankfully, the ballet tends to cut out some of the less savoury elements from the early versions of the story. Things like Sleeping Beauty waking up to find herself the mother of twins, and the prince's mum/current wife trying to eat the princess and her children. The ballet is mostly based on the Charles Perrault fairy tale La Belle au Bois Dormant, or The Sleeping Beauty in the Woods. A long-awaited princess is born and 7 fairies are invited to the christening. However, an 8th fairy was forgotten. But she turns up anyway and curses her. The princess will prick her finger on a spinning wheel and die. One of the other fairies manages to partially reverse the curse so that she will only fall asleep for 100 years, then be woken by a prince. Despite efforts to completely stop the curse, when the princess is around 16, she pricks her finger and falls asleep. The good fairy returns and sends everyone else to sleep, apart from the king and queen. 100 years later, a prince finds the castle and remembers a story about the sleeping girl within. He journeys inside, finds the girl, and is struck by her beauty. She awakes, they talk for many hours, and decide to get married. Most people think that the story ends there, but there is actually a second part, though folklorists aren't fully agreed on whether or not this is actually the second part of the story, or just another story that got tacked on to the end for some reason. Charles Perrault includes the second half, which involves the prince becoming king 4 years later, and bringing the princess and their 2 children to his palace. His mother, an ogre, is left in charge when the young king goes off to battle. She decides she doesn't like her new in-laws and tries to eat them, but she is tricked, and instead prepares a tub of vipers to throw them into, but ends up falling in herself and dies. The ballet was conceived when the director of the Imperial Theatre, Ivan Vsevolosky, approached Tchaikovsky and asked him to write a ballet based on Charles Perrault's fairy tale. He said yes, and came out with this absolute banger of a score, which was then choreographed by the godfather of ballet, Marius Pepita. However, the story ended up being a bit of a mix between Perrault's version and the Brothers Grimm version. Whether or not this was because Tchaikovsky actually used the Grimm version, Dornröschen, I don't know. When this was translated into the ballet, the first thing to go was the whole ogre mother-in-law likes eating kids thing. Full-length ballets don't usually have that many scenes. Generally, there's only 1 or 2 scenes per act, and maybe 3 or 4 acts. Sleeping Beauty has 5 scenes across 3 acts, including a prologue. But surprisingly, the ballet does actually add elements to the story. The fairies are given themes, colours, dance styles, and a sense of individuality not seen in the text, although the good fairies are reduced to 6, not 7. The crystal fountain fairy, often in pale colours, gives the gift of purity and integrity. The enchanted garden fairy wears bright colours and dances enthusiastically to upbeat music, often called the party fairy as well. She's associated with wheat flowers, once used to make a beautifying facial powder, which makes sense as her gift is beauty. The fairy of the woodland glade dresses in earthy tones and gives the gift of generosity. The fairy of songbird wears bright yellow and gives the gift of a beautiful voice. And my favourite fairy, the fairy of the golden vine, is also known as the finger fairy because she dances with pointed index fingers, which were possibly influenced when it was first choreographed by the recent discovery of electricity. She wears red and gold, and her gift is a little nebulous, but thought to be either passion, temperament, or just having a backbone. Fairy 6 is the Lilac Fairy, the only fairy to always have the same name across all productions of the ballet, who dances with particular grace and counteracts the evil curse. And the final fairy, not to be forgotten, is Carabosse. She is the fairy of wisdom and revenge. She often wears black or dark colours, and the version of Sleeping Beauty I saw had her move around the stage in a very particular way. Low, sweeping strides, swishing her cloak and every now and again stopping to raise her staff aloft, like this! Kind of like Rafiki in The Lion King. Fun fact, the name Carabosse is actually taken from another French fairy tale by Madame d'Aulnoy called The Princess Mayblossom. That Carabosse is an evil witch who curses the titular princess to 20 years of misery because the king had pranked her once. Fortunately, a good fairy then turns up to offer light at the end of the proverbial tunnel, thus Carabosse's revenge is thwarted. Wonder why they chose that name. When the princess, who is called Aurora, is older, she is shown various suitors. Again, not in the text. The other thing not in the text is the idea that the spindle which ultimately sends her to sleep is produced by Carabosse, the evil fairy. Whereas in the original story, it's just an old woman who somehow didn't hear the king's decree about spindles being banned, despite living in the castle. And actually, the evil fairy doesn't appear again in the Perrault story. She casts her curse and sods off. In the ballet, she does return, not just to produce the spindle, but 100 years later, she's still around, being a nuisance, and the good fairy and the prince have to defeat her once and for all. Although, something that the ballet, and I think most versions do cut out, is one of the most vital parts of the story. The princess's pet dog Puff. In the original French, it's there, as far as I can tell, and all the direct translations of Perrault include Puff. Bring back Puff! When the prince, who's called Désiré, arrives, 100 years later, in the ballet, the good fairy Lilac actually chooses him to be the one to wake up Aurora, as opposed to just the prince being in the right place at the right time in Perrault's version. The true love's kiss we're used to is actually an invention of the Brothers Grimm, as far as I can tell, and doesn't turn up anywhere else apart from the ballet. Which, for me, is the strongest argument for the idea that the Grimm's version informed the ballet. I suppose a kiss is just more dramatic than the prince falls to his knees and the princess randomly wakes up and they talk for 4 hours, which is what happens in Perrault's version, and infinitely better than what takes place in the Basili version, Sun, Moon and Talia. Don't Google it. It isn't pleasant. The ballet also has the king and the queen fall asleep for 100 years as well, whereas in the fairy tale, they also just sod off. The final act of the ballet is the most pointless one. Désiré and Aurora get married, and this is an excuse for a bunch of random characters to appear and have a dance, like Puss in Boots and the Bluebird. It kind of gives me Return of the King vibes when Frodo's lying in bed and all these characters he hadn't seen in ages show up again. Except instead of Gandalf, Gimli and Aragorn, it's Dumbledore, Luke Skywalker and Jon Snow. Kind of weird. But hey, it's a good excuse for some pretty outfits, so I'll let it slide. And that's how Sleeping Beauty was adapted for the ballet, with the specifics of the story reduced to bare basics, which can be easily communicated through props and gesture, characters given more opportunities to appear, and moments stretched to better incorporate the dance. But the story doesn't end there. The ballet remains an important stepping stone in the journey of this particular tale. The music has persevered as one of the more recognisable tunes on Classic FM, even informing the songs of the 1959 Disney film. And I think if you were to ask the average person to tell the story of Sleeping Beauty, they would most likely describe something more akin to the ballet than the Perrault story. Less the dancing. I also just want to quickly mention Matthew Bourne. Matthew Bourne is most famous for his reimagining of Swan Lake, where he nixed the romantic plotline, which was most of it, and instead turned it into a gothic tale of madness with overtones of homoeroticism and mental health. He also did A Sleeping Beauty, again pretty gothic, where he turned the fairies into vampire-like creatures and introduced Aurora's love interest, Leo the Gameskeeper, earlier on. When she falls asleep, after pricking her finger on an evil rose, the good fairy turns the love interest into a vampire creature as well, so that he's still alive in 100 years to wake her up. Also, the first part is set in 1890 and 1911, so after 100 years it's 2011 and the second act opens with a bunch of tourists taking pictures outside the old castle. I don't have anything to say about that, I just thought it was funny. And despite the vampires running around, the scariest thing in the ballet is that horrible baby puppet thing in the beginning. I did not like it. It is an interesting adaptation, and I really like the changes Bourne made to the story. He's very good at really amping up the themes of the original of love and death and rebirth. I love the gothic, so anything that sprinkles in vampires and poisoned roses and forests of creepy sleepwalkers is going to get my stamp of approval. So that's Sleeping Beauty. I thought it would be best to begin with a ballet that most people know the story of and its source material already. It's such a timeless tale and a really fun one to rework. It's slated a lot for having a passive female protagonist in The Princess, which is a little unfair because despite sleeping for 100 years, nothing really happens in that time. And also for its consent issues, which weren't actually in the original Perrault version. And the beauty of using fairy tales is that their core elements are so specific and easy to recognise that they actually give you a lot of space and freedom to do your own thing around them. Next time I will be taking a look at a few ballets, also with fairy tales at their centre, which are, perhaps, not quite as well known. Goodbye.